Hi guys, this is Mike Hibbert back with a tutorial for you to begin off our advanced Django tutorial series. The first subject, as we mentioned in our previous videos, is going to be based on how to create a custom user model and also use an alternative way of authenticating your users with the new authentication system that's come along with Django 1.5 and above. Now, just to demonstrate this, I've already gone ahead and created a project for us. I've called it EA, or Email Authentication, and inside of there I've added in some templates which will basically cover pretty much everything that you've seen in the previous free authentication tutorials, things like invalid login, logged in. In fact, they're more or less exactly line for line exactly the same HTML that we used in those tutorials. The main interesting part is that we have this custom underscore user folder. This is just basically something I created using the manage.py start app command, and from there we've added in a few more files. Now what we've added in is a forms file, a backends file, and the models file would have already been installed in there. Now, we're not going to use every single line of this code, but just enough to show you how the authentication system works. So we've created these things inside of the custom user app. We've made sure that inside of our settings .py that custom user is included in the installed apps collection. The next thing we need to do to configure things is just to basically add in a couple of lines of code so that we will then know that there's a custom user model instead of using the default model which comes along with the authentication system, and also that we have an alternative way of checking for authentication, which is what we're going to define in our backends.py file. So we just need to set that up so that the framework knows where they are inside of here. So the first line is auth underscore user underscore model equals custom underscore user dot custom user, and that's going to be defined inside of our models.py. Then the next line is authentication underscore backends equals, and then we have this tuple here with custom underscore user backends, so making a reference through to this file here, and then a class that we're going to define in there called custom user auth, and that's the class that's going to be used in terms of checking to see whether our email address is going to be the correct one, because we're going to switch from using the bog standard username and password setup to saying let's authenticate off people's email addresses. So now we've done that, we also just need to check and make sure that we've actually set some database settings. So at the top here I've created my project underscore folder global variable for the settings.py, and then set it to what the current working directory is, and that helps us to create a shortcut so that we can then build the path inside of our database settings and create a development.db file. And later on, once you've run syncdb, you'll find that that file exists there. We don't want to run syncdb just now though, because we haven't actually defined any models or custom authentication backends. So when we run syncdb, we want those to be existing before we actually do that, because when the tables are created for the authentication, it'll need to know what exactly the model looks like. So the first thing, now that we've set everything up in the settings.py file, is to go into the models file just here. So I've got that already open, and the first thing we're going to do inside of there is import a few things. So I'm going to import time zone so that we can grab the time, and obviously I'm going to bring in the models from the Django DB modules, because we're going to define the model, so we'll need that. Then I'm going to bring in contrib auth models abstract base user and base user manager. Now, you won't have come across managers in some of my previous tutorials, and the reason for that is because they're very simple, and I didn't really think that it was a massive leap in understanding for anyone to understand how managers work, because managers are more or less a way of shortcuts or creating shortcuts within your models so that you can do filtering of objects. And I'll give you an example of that just shortly. The next one is just to import send mail, so that we can maybe have a function that can send an email to a user from inside of the user's new custom model. And then we're also going to use some translation text. So basically, if you've got multilingual websites, this is going to be a really handy thing for you to be able to use, because it basically lets you pull in translations for words. And notice this weird little setup that I've got here. I've got from Django utils translation import you get text underscore lazy. So this is just basically a function, and we're importing it as underscore. Now, why would we do that? Well, we could just say you get text underscore lazy when we call the function all the time, but it's actually a lot easier and nicer to just use this underscore as a call. And I'll show you in a second or two how that looks and how it just basically makes your code a little bit more readable. So let's just define the class first of all. So the custom user manager is what we're going to do first. We're not going to do the actual class itself, or the user class, until we've defined what the manager can do. And this is important because when we actually define our user, the user will then be able to make reference to this class. So we create our custom user manager, derive it from base user manager, which is another manager that's already been described inside of the auth models section. And we're going to use this function underscore create underscore user. Now, underscore on a function name, you may find in future, if you come across this sort of thing, it usually means that this function only gets used internally inside of this class, and therefore is what you might consider to be a private function in some other language. Now, the reason why we're doing that is because we're going to make this function reusable so that we can use it to create normal users and super users. So we're just going to have this function here with some parameters set in, like is staff or is super user, and that those will be true or false, and that means we don't have to rewrite this code over and over again. We can just reuse it within the other outward facing methods. So we're going to get the time from now using the time zone module. If there is no email passed to here, then we're going to kick off about it and raise an exception saying value error. The given email must be set, because we absolutely must have an email in this case, because if we don't, then we can't log in, we can't authenticate against email addresses. Okay, so the method that we're using next is normalize underscore email, and that's something that comes part of the base user manager, and it basically helps us to make sure that email is not going to be full of all sorts of weird and wonderful characters, so that we can then treat it in a way that it's authenticatable, if you want to put it like that. Then we're going to create a user from this model that's associated with this custom user manager. We're going to pass in all of these items. So is super user last login was now, so hence we use the time now, because when we create a user, we want to say that right from the beginning, when was the last login? Well, if it's a brand new registration, the last login is potentially right now, so we're just setting that up straight away. Date joined is also now, obviously, because it's a brand new registered user. Then we basically set the password and save using self._db. Now this basically is something that comes derived from the base user manager, which is just a reference to the database that has already been set up in our settings.py. And then finally we return a user object. So that function just basically creates a brand new user in the system as a shortcut for us, and then it will pass in the relevant pieces of information like super user is active, that sort of thing. Now, because I said this is obviously an underscore in there, that means it's probably a private function if you see it in somebody else's code, which is what I'm trying to imply by my code too. I'm going to use create user as a name of a function again, but this time it's a much shorter function. So we use create user, self, email, password, and any extra fields that you could potentially use. So by having extra fields, we can then, make this more or less compatible with any site that we might use. So you could potentially just drag and drop custom user or this custom user app out of here and into some other application that you want to use it with without doing a massive amount of recoding of anything. The next function that we're going to define is create super user, and again this does the exactly same thing except for these two arguments here, which are both set to true. So if we look at the arguments of this private function that says is staff and is a super user, so we have two functions, one creates a normal user and the other one creates a super user. These are both functions that we are having to override for the base user the base user manager, because the user manager will be used in the authentication system but also in the registration process. Hence we're having to create our own user manager. So if you don't have create a user manager and you're trying to authenticate against an email address, then this is not likely to work. The main reason for that being is that we're making special issues of the fact that there's an existence of an email address in the system, and that's really why we're creating all of this code, just to make sure that we have that check-in and validation inside. Right, so with that we can now create our custom user, which is derived from abstract base user. Now this will then go through the whole process of defining what's actually inside a custom user. So let's just quickly jump ahead and I'll show you all of the fields rather than go through one by one. So we've got a username, a first name, a second name, an email, an address 1 and address 2, an area code, or even a country code. You can add as many fields as you like. You can put one in here that says likes cheese, goodness knows what else you could put in there, but you can more or less define all of the fields that you want inside of here. And in the normal way that you would define your model, you just basically use the models dot such and such a field function to define what this particular member variable should be. So that's pretty straightforward and more or less what you'll already understand about how to create models anyway. The next section is a bit more out of what you might have already seen, and in that it is that we point in towards the username field, and we're saying to the system our username field isn't username, isn't going to be this field, it's actually email, and hence we can then start to point towards that as the thing that should be checked for validity. Now later on we're going to go and do the back end and show you how that email is actually checked, but it's enough to say that this basically points the Django framework in the right direction and says this is what needs to be added. Okay, then we have a list of required fields, and then we do something unusual which you might not have seen. normally you would use a model, and you would say the name of the model dot objects dot all, or you might say filter or something like that when you're actually pulling records out using the ORM system. We're actually replacing the member variable for this user model. We're replacing this objects bit with a custom user manager. Now, let's just give you an example of that. Say normally we would go I don't know, articles dot or objects dot all, for instance. We're actually calling this object here, or this objects variable here, and what that is actually doing is calling a default manager inside of that model, one that you may not have set up yourself, and then it calls the all method to pull out everything out of there. What we're saying is that now our custom user doesn't have this object, the default version rather. It doesn't have this default version anymore. It's going to use the one we've defined. Okay, so whenever we call these objects section, we will find that we will be calling the methods inside of here. Now that's useful because when the authentication system uses this object, it will call for things like create user and create super user, and then that's when all of that filters down through to our little private method here. So by replacing the objects with our custom user manager, we're actually including our new functionality for checking to see if there's an email address actually associated. So the next section is just basically to add in some meta information. So as with all models, we create an embedded class inside of our model, meta, and we say verbose name underscore user. Now remember, we pulled in this you get text lazy from the translation system. We're just basically saying this is multilingual, so we will have a defined word for user inside here, and we're going to pull that out using our underscore that we redefined here, which is really just calling that function and saying get us the multilingual version of a word rather for user, and that'll be used when we create our forms. And again, we do that for the verbose name for plural for users, and again that'll be used in other parts of the Django framework. We then can use the get absolute URL, which will then help us to access the user's information, and again we're using email, so we've retied everything through to do that. Get full name is basically a string building function that's going to help us to get the full name of somebody. Get short name, just going to return the first name. Get email user is just basically like a helper function that'll basically take in the subject and the message and who the email's from, and automatically send an email with the contents of that email to whoever this user is in terms of emails. Okay, so that is pretty much our custom user with its new user manager built in. So the next thing is to then look at the back-end systems. Now the back end is the bit that's just basically going to do all the examinations and validate things and check whether the password's right, and also check whether the email matches. So first of all, let's import our custom user that we've just created. Then we're going to create a custom user auth. So that will match what we set up in our settings.py file. If I just scroll back down to there. So custom user auth in the backend.py. We're going to redefine rather the authenticate function, because later if we go to our views, we're going to do an authentication inside of our auth view, and we're going to say auth.authenticate username password, and that will equate to a call to this custom user auth. Okay, so we redefine this authenticate method here, and first of all inside of the function we're going to do a little bit of an exception handling situation. So we're going to use the try group or tag or whatever you want to call it, and we're going to try and get the user based on the email being equal to the username that we've passed into authenticate. So when we go to our views, we pass in the username, it will pass through to this back-end authentication system, and instead of passing it in as the username field, it will say the email has to be that. Then we check the password, and if the password is actually correct, then we'll return the user, and that's the authentication over and done with and successful. If there's an exception, as in the custom user doesn't exist, in other words, we did this search here and the username didn't pass and the password didn't pass, or one or the other didn't pass, then we get custom user does not exist, return none. That's enough to basically check to see if the email is correct and also check the password, and that's all we really want to do in this in terms of authenticating this. The next bit is just to basically add some support for this authentication, because inside of the Django's authentication framework, it has to call certain functions to work. So in terms of making a back end that works along with that and will have the right amount of support for the authentication system that's built in, we need to then redefine these further functions. So we need to redefine get user, because that will be called by the back-end systems, and it's literally just basically going to go and use the custom user model to get the user based on the primary key being equal to the user ID that's passed in. And if it's active, which is one of the settings that we will have set up in the model, then it'll return the user model. If it's not active, then it won't. However, that doesn't mean that the record doesn't exist in the database. It just basically means that that user's status is currently set as inactive. If it's not active, return none. And again, if there's an exception, we just return none in the case of no user found. Oh, too far. So that's our back end done. It's very simple, although it's a bit of a departure from the way that we're used to thinking of things in the previous frameworks. It actually simplifies things quite a lot, because you've got a lot less lines of code here, and also it gives you the chance to have things work in a non-standard way. Okay, so that's our basic authentication done. Our forms, we just basically want to define a form so that we can actually do some registration and login. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we need to do is import from Django Contrib auth forms the user creation form and user change form. Now, I'm not going to really go into too much depth about the user change form, because it's more or less the same as the user creation, but let's just go through that and see what happens. So we need to use the custom user, as is always the case with forms. We need to say which form which model this form is referring to. And I'm going to say custom user creation form, which is derived from the user creation form. And on its init function, we're going to use super to call the actual user creation form underneath. So we're saying call this method, or the initialization of this particular class through here, and pass it a reference to who's calling it, so that it knows which derived class has actually called it. We are deleting the username because we don't want to be able to record that. We're basically recording everything off of the email address, remember. So if someone puts anything in there, or there's accidentally any information in there from uninitialized memory, we want that to be blanked out, because that's not needed in the database. In our meta for this, we're saying that the model is the custom user model, and the fields are email. And again, this is exactly the same thing for our custom user change form. Now, we're not going to demonstrate that one obviously, but just to basically say that we want to show an email field, not a username field, in our forms. So that's the back-end code done. I think a quick skip through some of the forms might give you some idea of what's needed inside of here. But like I say, they're very similar to the registration and login forms that you've seen in previous tutorials. But here's the login form. So username, password inside of here. So all very similar to what you've seen before. Then the register is basically containing a CSRF token, but also just outputs the form as paragraphs inside of the HTML. So no special formatting there. The only thing I have really done that's customized is I've basically took the liberty of giving this a little bit of a skin and put in Bootstrap so that it looks nice in the browser, but nothing much more than that. So we've created our models, we've created a new manager so that this will work alongside the user authentication system and have the appropriate methods to be able to be called so that we can register people. We've defined our various fields, and we've identified the fact that you can have as many of those in there as you like, and it'll, depending on how useful that is to you, you can do that. Then we went through and we defined our custom authentication method, which was just a case of finding the user whose email matches and then checking their password and returning true if they're actually inside of the database or not. So nothing very complicated there. Now, over in the views, we've got a login view, which just basically renders the HTML for the login template. Okay, so in our auth view, we've got the username and password, which are pulled in from the HTML. And if we look in the login, we've got username and password as the names of our fields within the form. That doesn't necessarily mean that's actually what they are, because obviously we know we're authenticating off the email address. However, to make this more generic and so that we can actually swap things in and out very easily, so say we wanted to have this authenticate off a normal username, then in that case all we'd have to really do is switch out the back end, because we've stuck to using username as the parameter name and password as the password name. In the case of ours, all it does is it basically passes through those pieces of information, and we then do a check and pass a user back, and obviously we're doing a checkup based on the email address. So then if the user is not none, then auth will do the login for us, which is just basically to set the session up and everything to make sure that that information's there. and then finally redirect to the logged in page. Okay, so at this point you're probably going to want to do Python manage syncdb, and that will then go ahead, look at all the models involved and create our custom user model within the system. And then you should then have inside of the database, if I just get myself a folder open, we've got email auth EA, and inside of this development database you should then have created some tables. So you'll have the auth group, auth permissions, Django content, blah blah blah, auth permissions, but then you have this extra folder, or not folder, extra table called custom underscore user underscore custom user, and in there it'll have the columns that we have, but that will then replace the auth underscore user that you might have seen in previous databases. So with that, let's just see if we can get this to run. Okay, so if I just log this out, so we've got a register. And so my web app is broken. Right, bear with me 2 seconds and I'll just have a quick check to see what's going on. Okay, so what's basically happened is that I had somehow managed to set my debug equals false setting, and that basically made it so that it thought I was online and was checking, and then saw that the IP address was this, and then went, nope, that's not good enough, that's not allowed. So all I had to do was set things back to debug equals true on my local machine, and now it's happy. So word of warning, be careful that you don't change stuff and then forget that you did that. Okay, so here we have the app online and it's working. So the registration with the email address will be, I don't know, me@name.com with a password, blah blah blah. Once you set that in there, or me too, that's a good idea. I'll create a brand new user. Register. Column username is not unique. Okay, so I've basically already registered that user in there anyway. Okay, so say I had actually registered and was able to do that without putting duplicate email addresses in. I could then basically go to the login page, and hey presto, it allows me to authenticate based on email addresses. Okay, few little hiccups in there, but obviously, you know, nothing's perfect in the world wide web of development. So you know, if you come across a few errors, then you're not alone. Even us professionals who've done it for a long time, we still get a bit sideswiped by things from time to time, and that's to be expected because nobody can know everything. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you are eager to move on to the rest of the tutorials in the series. So, thanks for watching.